Hello and welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andy for a special episode on location here at Gettysburg National Military Park, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm standing today over by the 6th Wisconsin Monument near the railroad cut on the first day's fighting west of town. And today we're going to talk about a subject that I think you're going to find fascinating. We're going to talk about the Iron Brigade Guard. The Iron Brigade Guard is a fairly unique organization during the Civil War, and it only existed for a short period immediately preceding the Battle of Gettysburg, and then saw action here the first day of July 1863. It was an attempt by the Iron Brigade's commander, Brigadier General Solomon Meredith, to create a reserve force for himself in the brigade, and it ended up playing a decisive role at the battle here for the railroad cut early in the morning, July 1st, 1863. So right now we're on McPherson's Ridge, and behind me you can see the seminary from the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And of course right here is the 6th Wisconsin and 95th New York monuments by the famous railroad cut on McPherson's Ridge. This is a pretty unique organization in the Civil War and was formed on June 22nd, 1863, when Brigade General Order 24 ordered the creation of the Iron Brigade Guard. It was to consist of 100 men and 2 officers, drawn from all 5 regiments. Now, the initial selection of men was not evenly distributed amongst the regiments. Some regiments in the brigade had more than others, but within a few days it was standardized that each brigade provided 20 men, and that First Lieutenant Lloyd Harris of the 6th Wisconsin commanded, supported by Second Lieutenant Levi Showalter of the 2nd Wisconsin. So you might ask, what's the purpose of creating a guard of only 100 men? Well, the Iron Brigade had 5 regiments at this time, ranging from almost 500 men in the 24th Michigan down to about 250, 300 men in the 2nd Wisconsin. Well, the idea with this is by creating a picked force of chosen men, Meredith created something that's kind of a throwback to an earlier era of military history. This kind of is similar to the idea of British units in the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, creating picked battalions by taking the grenadier companies from different regiments and grouping them together. These kind of elite formations were used by the British as spearhead and rearguard organizations at some of the most famous battles of the American Revolution. The organization of the Iron Brigade Guard has parallels with other units in the Civil War. Out west in the Army of the Cumberland, Major General William Rosecrans created a pioneer brigade that was a brigade-level organization, but similarly drew a few men from each company, and each company would reflect a brigade, and it created a parallel organization so that he had a picked force of engineers. At the Battle of Stones River in December 1862, the Pioneer Brigade played a critical role in the battle. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, the 1st Corps was encamped several miles south of here at Marsh Creek on the Emmetsburg Road. As they began marching up the road towards the sound of the fighting already going on at Gettysburg, while Buford's 1st Division of the Cavalry Corps is fighting to the north and west of town with the advanced elements of Heath's Division. As they reached what's now the Gettysburg battlefield, the Iron Brigade thought they would be going through the town of Gettysburg, but in fact, on the outside of town near what's now we know as the Cadore House, General Reynolds and his staff were pulling down fence rails to direct the 1st Division of the 1st Corps to proceed directly to where we're standing now. As they came up over Seminary Ridge, Cutler's Brigade of Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers deployed on either side of the railroad cut, and off to my left, the Iron Brigade deployed towards McPherson's Ridge and began their fighting with Archer's Brigade down there. As the Iron Brigade moved towards McPherson's Ridge, they began to deploy. They deployed into a column of regiments, so each regiment would deploy into a column of companies, deploy forward, so now they're stacked up in a column of regiments with the 6th Wisconsin, and then finally the Iron Brigade Guard at the rear. At this point, General Doubleday came up to the back of the Iron Brigade and decided he needed a reserve, so he pulled the 6th Wisconsin out of line and put them up to the seminary. The Iron Brigade Guard ended up following the 6th Wisconsin up to the seminary. Whether or not that's what General Meredith intended of his guard, it actually turned out to be fortuitous for the Union cause. It makes sense, too, with the commander of the Iron Brigade Guard being an officer of the 6th Wisconsins, the regiment directly in front of them. They just decided to follow Lieutenant Colonel Dawes in the 6th Wisconsin. At this point, things began to turn against the Union on their right. The right of Cutler's line was flanked by Davis's brigade of Mississippians and began to collapse. Union troops south of the pike came under heavy fire as the Confederates moved into the railroad cut here. And it was at this point that a series of events happened that played a critical role as this fight was developing. The 14th Brooklyn and 95th New York, fighting over by McPherson's barn, wheeled to their right and face the railroad cut and began to move forward. At the same time, the 6th Wisconsin, over by the seminary, was ordered to attack. At this point, the 6th Wisconsin had all 10 companies present, but had decided to consolidate and were only parading 8 companies. Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, commanding the regiment, took the Iron Brigade Guard, 100 men strong, divided it into 2 companies, and placed it as the flank companies on his regiment. This is a nice parallel to eras in the past because picked forces like grenadiers traditionally paraded in the flanks of battalions. It's a point where you're on the flank, it's the dangerous point. It's also the point of movement, so you want your best troops in those locations. And it's a fitting thing that this Iron Brigade Guard, this force representing all 5 regiments, ended up in these places of honor on the flanks of the battalion. It's at this point that the 6th Wisconsin and the Iron Brigade Guard make their charge. About 450 men, 350 from the 6th Wisconsin, and 100 men of the Guard, again representing the entire Iron Brigade. The men come over the pike and come here into the railroad cut. Now, all 3 federal regiments hit about the same time, and there's a wild fight that breaks out here on the edge of the railroad cut. It's right around where the monuments are today is where Corporal Francis Waller of the 6th Wisconsin takes the colors of the 2nd Mississippi, which would earn him the Medal of Honor. Davis's Mississippi Brigade is shattered in the fighting here, loses hundreds of prisoners, and the brigade is completely combat ineffective for the rest of the day. They fall back, and the Union right flank at this crisis point is stabilized, largely due to the charge of the 6th Wisconsin, supported by this picked force of men. Now, the Iron Brigade Guard continued to fight with the 6th Wisconsin. They would fall back to Seminary Ridge, off my right here, and they would fight up what's now near Lee's headquarters, and eventually fall back through town and reform with the Iron Brigade on what's now Culp's Hill. The Iron Brigade Guard was, at this point, as far as we know, dissolved. Its commander, Lloyd Harris, was wounded near the end of the fighting here at the railroad cut. And it makes sense with the massive casualties, almost 2/3 casualties that the Iron Brigade took, that whatever was left of the Iron Brigade Guard was desperately needed by their home regiments. There wasn't a need for an Iron Brigade Guard anymore when the brigade barely paraded 700 men. This special, short-term organization had an outsized role on the first day's fighting here on the Battle of Gettysburg. And it actually is a great proof of concept for what General Meredith pulled them aside for. He pulled them aside not to act as a special sharpshooter or skirmisher force, but to be a reserve, a guard of picked men for a key moment. And it ended up, not by his direction, but just by chance, they were used precisely for that reason. Without those extra men, it's doubtful that the 6th Wisconsin's charge would have been able to be pressed home with enough force to do as much damage as it did. That extra 100 men probably tipped the balance for this charge here, making a dramatic effect on the Union right. While they were only in existence for about 10 days, it proved that the Iron Brigade Guard is an interesting organization and worth our time to talk about. The Union's victory here at the railroad cut, in conjunction with the Iron Brigade's decisive defeat of Archer's brigade off to the left, bought the Union breathing time. Instead of having to continue to redeploy to deal with the threat here of Davis's Mississippi Brigade, Davis's Mississippi Brigade was removed from the action on this day. Again, pardon action to the Iron Brigade Guard and the 6th Wisconsin making their charge, and again with the New Yorkers of the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York. With this breathing space, the Union could bring more troops to the battlefield, deploy. The entire First Corps was able to get on the field and deal with the shock of the loss of General Reynolds. If they had had to continue to fight, sure, General Doubleday was now commanding the Corps, now commanding the field, but by giving them a little bit of time, it allowed them to reorganize and make adjustments to their organization, to their positions, and to be ready for the larger assaults that would come in a few hours from the west and north. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion of this rare organization and its great throwback to the military roots of Europe and the early part of American military history. I hope you can make a connection to understanding this small group of men and the impact they had here at Gettysburg. I want to say thank you to Gettysburg National Military Park for letting us be here on location, on the place where this really happened 160 years ago. For Civil War Digital Digest, I'm Andy. We'll catch you next time.